Welcome back. So we left on discussing the impacts of COVID on governments around the world and how it underscored certain realities of a fragmented or uncooperative world order, or a world order in the age of globalization that's still made up of separated nation states that are uncooperative and unable to handle the task of handling a globalized pandemic. It underscored that when international cooperation is needed the most is when it actually deteriorates. When something affects every country in the world, you see nation states retreat from cooperation and instead are focused on the interests of their independent citizenry and want their governments to do whatever is in the narrow interests of their nation state in the midst of a crisis. Citizens demanded governments to hoard or compete for PPE and vaccines during the pandemic. We see an inability for states to agree on border closures, some wanting closed borders, others wanting them open. There were also differing vaccine regulations on different vaccines and which countries recognized certain vaccines and which ones didn't. There was differences in public health policy regulations, some governments taking the crisis much more seriously than others and willing to instill public health regulations and protocols to meet the virus, while other countries didn't believe the pandemic was as serious as many stated, as I mentioned prior. So the pandemic underscored an inability to cooperate. Despite the large array of global institutions designed during non-crisis periods to handle such events, when the pandemic hit, these institutions and agreements and organizations fell out the window, and it was a return to nationalism as a response to the pandemic. While there were forms of international cooperation, you saw this reflexive uh, move by states to be more nationalistic when it comes to preserving the health and well-being of their own citizens. So some of this was due to globalization. It was the first pandemic to hit a globalized world. And in some ways, globalization made it better because the global infrastructure allowed the ease of moving goods around the world, even within an emergency setting. But because supplies lagged, the movements of goods didn't matter as much as the production disruptions and the supply constraints that were impacting many different countries around the world, especially when we just talked about with PPE. People also spread the virus. With people traveling around the world very frequently, this clearly accelerated the speed of the virus's spread, right? So because the virus itself and because we were so global, or the integration of the world was so was already in a period, we were already living in a period of globalization, this integrated world economy where travel and trade was happening all the time. This clearly meant that by the time we realized the virus had hit, because of the globalized world environment we lived in, um, it was already spreading much faster than we could respond to it. The fact that we do not produce local goods and rely on global supply chains was also a huge weakness. Canada did not have the infrastructure to make vaccines or PPE and relied on a hyper competitive global supply chain during a period of crisis, which naturally created some problems, right? People forced people who were not, the one good thing about the virus, perhaps, and perhaps why you're in this course too, and perhaps why you're all interested in global business, it forced people who were not concerned with geopolitics or globalization become much more aware of the globalized world which we live in. People were separated from their families over years. Um, there were businesses that were heavily reliant on migrant workers, and these businesses were in dire need of workers because of the pandemic. Businesses did not have the goods to complete the products that they were manufacturing. So the car market is a clear example of this because of all these disruptions. If you needed to build during the pandemic and did not have the goods that were necessary for building were in very short supply during the pandemic, which and highly inflated prices. And you see this in the rise in the housing market as well, and the rising value of homes. For many governments in the world, they were unable to provide the services necessary for their population because of all because of this pandemic, right? The governments were completely unprepared and blindsided, specifically those that were already facing numerous crises. So what will the world look like after COVID? This is also what we'll have to see, right? Um, we can see how the world's become very geopolitically connected, and this slide, I forgot, this is already, we've already mentioned all this, but please review this as well. So we don't know what the world will look like after COVID. Numbers continue to rise and fall. And this week, there has even been a shutdown, rumored shutdown in Wuhan once again. So we don't know what will happen. There's also the China zero COVID strategy, which is very different than the West's response to the COVID crisis. We do not know what variant will come next and how well our vaccines will work against any new variants that arise in future months or future years. We're still developing treatments and pills and therapies to fight COVID once you get it. But it's uncertain how every government will react if there is another outbreak, especially at this point when there's a lot of exhaustion on behalf of populations, especially those who've already undergone tight restrictions over the last couple of years. There is a lot of hesitancy by governments due to the unpopularity of many COVID restrictions to install public health, the kind of lockdowns that we saw during the initial COVID pandemic. So the worry is that even if we have a much more dangerous variant or there's another outbreak, how governments will respond to this is still very much up in the air. The end of the virus will need to be global, though. If it continues to pose a significant threat in any country, it will continue to impact all countries, right? Because variants arise and mutate in one geographic area, and it quickly spreads because of the fact that we're still living in this globalized, interconnected world. A disappointing aspect of the new COVID pandemic is the rapid spread of conspiracy theories against public health protocols through social media. We talked a little bit in previous weeks about the media and misinformation and the spread of misinformation and what this means to country security and the stability of each of these states. And because of globalization, a lot of false or misleading information is spread at a speed across borders that was previously unimaginable. And a lot of the time we don't know the root of this information, if it comes from states that are perhaps opposed, if it's an expression of pre-existing tensions between states. So there's been lots said about the role of Russia in spreading misinformation within within Western states, such as the United States and Canada. And we don't know the root cause, often because this happens in over the internet. It's very difficult to find the source of these forms of misinformation, whether they're coming from within, if they're expressing dissatisfaction from within nation states, or if they're actually the intentional spread of misinformation by state actors. So that's a new threat that many states are having to come to grips with because of this globalized communication around the world at this. This has led to a transnational anti-vaccination movement to arise, where there's protests around the world over what COVID restrictions are necessary to ensure public health of the citizenry, and even misinformation that questions whether even COVID even exists. So governments have been pushed over their COVID policies and have been forced to reconcile with large segments of the population with one section of the population believing in public health and science and the measures that are necessary to control the outbreak of a virus, such as implementing vaccination programs, mandatory masking, social distancing, etc. But then there's also a large segment of various different populations around the world who are distrustful of their state, of public health, and are either unknowledgeable or misinformed in regards to the reasoning behind public health measures and vaccination programs. And so this misinformation expands this distrust that, and we've talked previously, how fundamental trust is in both international relations as well as good governance within a state. So this new resistance to COVID measure, so we can see here that there's a dividing line that's happening across world order, where within every state around the world, there's movements that are very supportive of vaccination programs and policies to combat the spread of COVID. And then you also see a resistance in various states around the world to COVID measures. And this is a global phenomenon now. There's a global anti-vaccination movement, or a transnational anti-vaccination movement, or anti-COVID public health policy movement. It often expands beyond just vaccination, but against all policies that are directed towards combating the pandemic. The good news is that the pandemic will end sometime soon, and the disease will likely become endemic. We will need to live with the virus, and it might even become a seasonal event, with less cases in the summertime and then rising in the wintertime as people enter into closer quarters and are inside for longer periods of time. It means that moving forward, we will have to protect our elderly population in ways that we previously, didn't imagine having to protect them or separate ourselves from the elderly community in certain periods of time to make sure that we can manage their well-being. There will be a return to some sense of normalcy, and governments, businesses, and citizens will need to adjust to a new reality. Countries will likely need to devote more resources in combating and preparing for future pandemics as well. It is unlikely that this will be the last pandemic in a globalized world, so it is imperative that governments are adequately resourced for such an event. This might require more domestic or national production of PPE or vaccines. This would mean that countries would not need to rely on global supply chains during a moment of crisis, which was, created such a disruption in the early years of COVID. The risk that you might be preparing for a virus that might not come for many years, and spending money on a virus that might even happen, 25 years down the line, is something that will sometimes be politically unpopular for many states, right? Because, attributing large amounts of taxpayer money and funds to, COVID 45, something that happens in 2045, might not be as popular for governments today, right? Because especially when there's already so much austerity within the state, and there's so much, the allocation of resources is already so tight that it's very difficult to attribute such large funds to an event, or in preparation for an event that we're not sure of when it will occur. And it could even occur, decades down the line. We will also have to see if organizations or if corporations reorganize to not be as reliant on global supply chains. So corporations are also forced to transform their behavior as well, because we can see that many corporations, because of the pandemic, face numerous crises because of these disruptions in the supply chain. So they might need to reorganize themselves in order to strategize for another crisis also. There's some big questions on, will people be as reliant on global supply chains, or will they rely more on domestic supply chains in the future? So these are, will populations look more inwardly rather than expanding their trade networks around the globe? So these are all big questions that many of us are asked, or many of those interested in global political economy or global business are asking themselves as we move forward in this post-pandemic world. What happens to global tourism? This is another big question. We don't know what the global impacts on global tourism really will be yet. There has been a little bit of an uptick in global travel now that the viruses seem to wane. But many countries are reliant on tourists, and any more disruptions akin to what happened in the early days of COVID would dramatically impact the economies of these states that are heavily dependent on global tourism. If people are hesitant or uncomfortable flying or traveling, these economies would suffer, especially if there's some unevenness on between states on how severe the COVID pandemic is. In some states, obviously, we see higher numbers than other states. People are also very hesitant to come back to work. And this impacts real estate, as well as various industries and sectors that cater to individuals who work in urban centers, namely restaurants. I was at a Blue Jays game recently, and I was walking by and I recognized someone I knew working at a restaurant. And they were mentioning how the businesses, the restaurants around the downtown Bay Street area have been really suffering because a lot of their customer base were people coming into work every day to work on Bay Street, et cetera, to work in the financial sector of Toronto. And because a lot of them are now working from home at distance, a lot of the surrounding businesses have suffered greatly. I walked by and the restaurant was completely empty on a Friday night, which was very shocking, right? A lot of the time in previous years, people would finish work and then go spend the night at the bar or eating out. And now, because so many people are working from home or working from a distance, these businesses around are also suffering. So we see this kind of deterioration of urban centers as well. How much cooperation are we going to have going forward after all this distrust produced by nation states during the pandemic, and the vaccine nationalism that was produced by the pandemic is also something that's going to have long-term ramifications. The question of whether the public will even accept another pandemic is another major question. Will they demand different things from governments moving forward? Will citizens demand more from governments, or will they demand that their governments do not respond with strict COVID measures as they did, or strict public health measures as they did during the early days of the pandemic? These are big questions that many people are asking themselves. The university system was dramatically impacted by COVID, and there's been so much uncertainty about how this system will rebound in various countries as well. Especially with the move to, as we're doing right now today, this move to distance learning rather than in the classroom interacting with a one-on-one or in a classroom setting with your professors or teachers. So this has been a big change for the university system as well, and the college system. So how will things look after the pandemic? Nobody knows. Nobody knows how or when it will end or what new realities will look like in the post-COVID world. But it is clear that the virus has created new risks and opportunities for global business moving forward. What will be the biggest change after COVID is a big question, right? What will the new realities look like? When will the new world arrive? What will be the biggest challenge after COVID, or biggest change after COVID? Will we be better off or worse off in the post-COVID world order? Some have argued that because there's been a move towards a more involved state in our day-to-day lives, that because of this, citizens might demand more and more from the state. In Canada, we received the CERB benefits from during the COVID crisis. Now there's a big question of whether to expand these kind of things into UBI programs, et cetera. There's all these things of what will citizens demand of the state in a post-COVID world order, now that we know what states can provide in moments of crisis. So these are some big questions that everyone's asking themselves. And that's pretty much all I have for you all today. Some big questions to think about, some huge uncertainties, because so many of us do not know what the post-COVID world will look like. So there's just mostly what this final long lecture is to discuss is just these big questions as you enter the world of global business, as you study state behavior, as you study this behavior of major corporations and citizens and markets and global trade. These are all more just large questions to meditate over as we move forward. Last one big reminder is, again, the accountability assignment is canceled for this week, and that the final self-reflection will be worth 15% rather than 10%. I look forward to grading the rest of the G20 assignments. I'm mostly through them now, but they're looking quite good. So you'll be receiving those very shortly. Other than that, all you have to do this week is just review the materials I provided, kind of ponder over these big questions. And that's all I have for you. So I hope you have a wonderful week, and take care.